let's talk about everything that went wrong with Netflix's recent adaptation of Jane Austen's final novel, Persuasion. Persuasion is a second-chance romance. It tells the story of Anne Elliott, a woman who gave up her early love, Captain Wentworth, because he was not in the correct social class and she was persuaded away from marrying him. At the start of the novel, she is 27 years old, she is looking a bit haggard and she's just on the cusp of becoming a bit of an old crone or a spinster for the time anyway, and Captain Wentworth comes back into her life and the story explores their relationship and the second chance that they may or may not get together. I was interested to watch a film adaptation of this because I've recently read all of Jane Austen's books and I finished with Persuasion, so it's a book that's very much fresh in my mind, and so I was really able to see all of the problems with, frankly, a very bad adaptation. And I'm going to get into some of the main issues that I had with this adaptation. Part 1. The worst of both worlds. In my view, there are broadly speaking two ways that you can try and adapt a book to a film. The first way is to try and do it as faithfully as possible. Think of something like Lord of the Rings, the original trilogy that is. These films were adapted as faithfully as possible. The filmmakers explicitly said that they weren't interested in shoving down their message or their ideas down the audience's throat or interpreting Tolkien's work, and instead wanted to try and keep it as true to the books as possible. That's one way to do an adaptation, and of course it tends to be quite popular with fans of the work because ultimately that's what you want to see. You want to see the vision of the author, or as close as you can get to that vision when someone else is obviously doing a little bit of interpretation, on the screen. So that's usually what fans of books really like, and it's certainly an adaptation style that I really like, especially in a case where there isn't yet a faithful adaptation in that way. But this isn't the only way that you can try and adapt a novel. You could also do a retelling, I would say, of the story, which is where you take either the general structure of the story and put it in a different setting, or you take a character, perhaps they're like an underdeveloped character in the book, and then you expand upon them. And so this is the second way that you can adapt a story. The problem that I had with Persuasion is that on the one hand it tries to be a retelling and does things which we'll get into, but at the same time it isn't confident enough to actually do a proper retelling, and so it also tries to be a faithful adaptation. And in my view this just doesn't work at all, and you end up with lots of consistencies in terms of the plot and in terms of the character. Before we get into those problems, I would just like to emphasise that I'm not saying that this retelling of stories is a bad idea. I think, in fact, Bridget Jones' Diary is an adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, essentially. In its core elements, the plot is the same. But rather than try and adapt a story that's told in the late 1700s and just apply that same plot to the modern day where it wouldn't make sense because the cultural norms are very different from men and women and just society in general, instead what you get is the taking of the general setup or the main kind of theme of Pride and Prejudice. These two lovers, well, would-be lovers, who misunderstand each other because one of them is a bit prideful and one of them is a bit prejudiced, and we just go with that basic structure. We also throw in the kind of wolfish, rakish character, and we go with it like that. Some things just don't translate to the modern time, so those things get cut. Obviously, Bridget Jones' Diary doesn't have lots of sisters and the whole family wealth drama, because that doesn't really make sense in our modern world. It's not like young people are dependent on inheritance, and neither are women dependent on marriage in order to have an income. Now, to me, Bridget Jones' Diary is a fantastic film and a great adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, because what it does is it retells the story, rejuvenates it and puts it in a modern setting, and doesn't try to apply something that just doesn't make sense to apply in the modern time. It recognises that it's being told in a different time, and so it makes changes accordingly. The problem with Persuasion is that it just does not do this. I found that the plot was inconsistent because of this, I found that the characters were inconsistent, and even the costumes confuse me at times. Like sometimes the costumes look like they're of the time period, and then at other times it looks like it's sort of basically modern but a bit kind of, trying to look old but is very modern, if that makes sense. So all of these things just really confused me and threw me off. But let's start with the problems with the characterization, and obviously Anne Elliott is going to be the big one because she's our main character. Now, I will say I'm not criticising Dakota Johnson, who I think is a fantastic actress, and who I also think could have made a very good traditional Anne Elliott, in that she just comes across as someone who can pull off that kind of character, the sort of quiet, shy-ish character who's made a mistake in her past and now she's a bit broody and she's kind of very much in her head. I think she could pull off that really well. Unfortunately, that's not the character that she was given. In the Netflix adaptation of Persuasion, Anne Elliott, instead of being who she is in the books, seems to me to just be a generic Austen heroine. It's almost like the screenwriters didn't read the book and just thought, well, it's an Austen novel, so the heroine has to be sassy and witty like Lizzie Bennet, because that's all Jane Austen's heroines apparently, even though it's not. And then they just went with that. They just assumed that that's what she was like and made her all sassy. And the problem is, that just doesn't work for Anne's character. Precisely because most of the tension in the story is built around Anne's inability to talk to Captain Wentworth to address the, love drama going on between them, and this is what holds her back. But if she's sassy and, got a sharp tongue, why wouldn't she just go and talk to him in the first place? I also found it very hard to empathise with this interpretation of Anne Elliott. The kind of constant, sarcastic, breaking the fourth wall comments that she has on her family and the people around her just make her come across as a little bit kind of above it all. She feels like she's superior to everyone. She doesn't really come across as a character who has made some mistakes and, you want to empathise with her. She just comes across as someone who's, just a bit bitter and not in a good way. I do find it amusing that the writers of this adaptation seem to think that the only way a modern audience could relate to Anne Elliott is by making her into an alcoholic and having her constantly making annoying, asinine comments at people and being snarky and sassy because that's a strong woman nowadays and that's all we care about. It just didn't work, and it didn't make her relatable at all. It just made her come across as not a especially nice person. And it's not like the story decided to make her bitter in that way and then have her at some kind of moment realise the kind of bitter person she'd become, and then she changes at the end. They just kind of went with it, and to be honest, they didn't even go all that far with it. We had a couple of scenes where she's like swiveling wine, but it's not like they really lingered on it. It wasn't something that was essential to her character. It was just a way of showing you, oh look, she drinks alcohol now because she's made a mistake, just like you. It's just not especially interesting, it doesn't add anything to the plot, and it's kind of done in a half-assed way at the end of the day. Another character who I think was done a complete disservice was Lady Russell. Lady Russell is a kind of mother figure to Anne. Anne's real mother is actually dead in the story, and this Lady Russell is her mother's best friend. Now, Lady Russell looks out for Anne, but one of the tensions in their relationship is the fact that it was actually Lady Russell who convinced Anne not to marry Captain Wentworth. And in the books, this is because Lady Russell is a lady, and of course she cares a lot about social class and standing, and she doesn't want Anne to make a bad marriage. And this is the kind of tension in their relationship, and I think it makes for a really interesting relationship because you have this character or this figure who could just be a kind of fairy godmother type, but she does care about Anne, of course, but she also is a semi-antagonist because she's the one who encouraged her to make that terrible decision. So that's a really interesting dynamic. However, in the film, this is still there, but it's kind of dealt with early on in the story. And also they changed Lady Russell's character in such a bizarre, nonsensical way that I don't understand how this kind of woman that they've created in this story would actually persuade Anne not to marry a soldier. So we find out that Lady Russell, her husband's died and she's a bit lonely, so she likes to make little trips to Europe to have some fun with lots of men, which, fine, more power to her and all that, but it does not make sense to me that a woman who would do that would care about someone marrying a soldier when she's going off to Europe and getting, doing what she's doing. So again, they wanted to do this because at the end of the film, spoilers, they want to have a kind of generic love message about how all love's fine and blah, 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 blah. And to do that, and then we have a little kind of montage scene, and Lady Russell's like looking at her little ticket as she's off to, have a good time in Europe. And, whatever, but again, it doesn't make sense. And it doesn't make sense for Lady Russell's character, because she's meant to be a little bit of a snob. She's meant to be a little bit, kind of supporting the morals of the time. She just also happens to love Anne and is able eventually to realise what she's done wrong and come to empathise with her in the story. So again, another thing where they wanted to do something modern, but it didn't work for the character, and they didn't think about it, but it just doesn't work. And this to me is the main problem with the film. I think it would have been actually just a lot better if instead of trying to keep the film in its time period, sort of, but then putting all these little modern bits in, what they should have just done is, done a Bridget Jones, which is to say, you take the basic plot of a woman who could have got with someone at some time and was persuaded out of it for another reason. Maybe it's a more modern reason. Why don't you make it so it relates to modern women's problems? What are the reasons that someone might persuade a woman not to get married to a man when she's very young nowadays? That's something that we could definitely do, because as a society we tend to think that people shouldn't marry young anymore. So you could have a similar sort of story that is modern, where Anne is persuaded, say, by a careerist sort of friend who's like, no, you shouldn't marry this guy who loves you because you should go to university and have a career and all these things. And then she goes and does that, and then she meets him again. That would be a much more realistic framing, because it applies to the modern time. And you could then have, you know, your kind of Lady Russell careerist woman, you could have her going off and having lots of sex in Europe, because it would make sense with the time period. And it wouldn't be inconsistent of her to say to her friend, look, you shouldn't get married so young, you should have fun like me. That would make sense for a character like that, because it's moved to the modern time. But instead, we try and keep things in the past, sort of, but then try and have these modern bits, and the problem is, the logic does not work. The film does not work for those reasons. I think a very cynical part of me just thinks that the reason for that kind of thing was just so that they could get butts in seats by saying, you know, suggesting that it looks like a faithful adaptation in terms of the setting, the costumes, and all of the aesthetics, but then actually doing the modern stuff and sneaking that under the carpet. And it's like, well, if you do that, you don't really satisfy anyone, because the person who wants the retelling isn't going to be impressed by a not very good retelling, and the person that wants a faithful adaptation is going to feel duped. So either way, you lose. Part 2. Anne Elliott and Captain Wentworth. So Anne Elliott is one of Austen's more sombre heroines. Like Fanny Price, she's someone who stays a little bit in the shadows. Unlike Fanny Price, who is a little bit fragile, Anne is a bit more strong-willed than Fanny. She has more of a sense of herself, but she's still quite quiet, she's still quite reserved, and it's these character traits that are part of why she's persuaded not to marry Captain Wentworth. Even the story of Persuasion, to me, is quite a sombre and sad story, even with its somewhat happy ending. Because it's a story in which someone has made a decision that's had a lasting impact on their life, and when we meet Anne for the first time, she's kind of faded, her beauty is gone, and she's very sad. And there's a lot of pathos in the story, and it's a shame that such a rich, deep story that could move people a lot is turned into this kind of very shallow, sassy story. And Anne's character is just completely, stripped away of all of her depth and nuance in order to create this relatable modern heroine. As I've said, I think that Dakota Johnson is a great actress, and I think having seen her in films like Suspiria, where she does play this sort of shy, or at least for part of that film, she plays a sort of shy young woman, and I think that she could do that really well with Anne. I think she just has, I don't know what it is about her as an actress, but I think she could do the character of Anne Elliott really well if she was written in the appropriate way, but unfortunately, she wasn't. That being said, I think the biggest disappointment of Persuasion is Captain Wentworth, who is just turned into a love puppy, drippy, the eyes look like they're constantly about to cry. It's just that boring trope of a love puppy is all he is in this story, which again, it seems like what they've done is they've just taken this idea of Mr. Darcy as, well, he's like a brooding man who's in the military, and it's all very kind of masculine, but in a soft way, because he's a lover, not a fighter, even though he was in the army, but whatever. And they just wanted to go with that. And unfortunately, that again just strips him away of any of his depth, anything that would make him interesting, and just makes it really dull to watch. All of his scenes are boring, and I don't think that the actor is necessarily bad, but he's just not given much to do aside from look like a lovesick puppy. One of the best parts of Persuasion is the part when Anne sees Captain Wentworth for the first time, and they have these really awkward, sometimes quite funny, because they're so awkward, interactions with each other. And another thing that really comes through, and that has to come through with Wentworth, is that when we meet him for the first time, he looks great. He's charismatic and he's successful, and he's also potentially, because as he hints, is looking for a wife. And this is meant to contrast with Anne, who is faded and quiet and sad because she's given up and kind of lost her way. And that should come through in the story, and it's something that I think you could do really well in a visual medium, is really show the difference. But unfortunately, we don't get that, because we've stripped both of the characters. We've changed Anne into this sassy, empowered woman, so she's too bright, and it doesn't make sense. And we've, turned Captain Wentworth into this sad little drip, which again doesn't work, and it ruins that part of the story. And so I think that's something you could just convey it really well. Not only that initial difference between them, but also Anne's changes physically as she comes closer to Captain Wentworth, and then they unite at the end of the story. I think that could just all be much better done than it was. But unfortunately, we had to just change the characters in a way that didn't make sense and that just stripped them of any depth or interest. Part 3, breaking the fourth wall. So here's my problem with the breaking of the fourth wall, which I've already mentioned a little bit, but I want to explain a little bit more what the issue is. If you want to do this kind of fourth wall breaky thing, or have a voiceover who sets the scene, you need to make sure that that voiceover or the person who's breaking the fourth wall does something, adds something to what's going on. Otherwise, it's just redundant and pointless and takes you completely out of the movie. And unfortunately, with this adaptation, it constantly does that, because most of the time it's not needed, and in fact it's usually used as a lazy way to actually tell the story that's going on. And even when it doesn't do that, it just takes you out of the story by just having these incredibly lame, sassy jokes that never land. So now it's true in the actual book Persuasion that Anne's family members, her father and her two sisters, are kind of stereotypes. They're not the most depth characters, they're kind of, Austen's comedy characters. You have the vain father who's in love with himself and no one else. You have the elder daughter who's also kind of like the father, in love with herself, looks down on Anne. And then we have Mary, the younger one, who is a hypochondriac and also one of the funniest characters. And also, I will get to it later, but one of the better parts of this film. But they're made even more shallow and boring by the way that they're portrayed in the film. When we meet them, instead of actually meeting them and seeing them in actual situations, we have Anne telling us what these characters are like, and then immediately after she's told us, we then have an illustration of what these characters are like in a scene. And it's like, well, if you're going to show us the scene where we would learn that they're vain up their own backsides or a hypochondriac, we don't need Anne to tell us about this because we're going to see it. So it's just a waste of time to actually have that scene in the first place. It also makes Anne come across, like I said before, as just a judgmental, not very nice character, since these are her family members after all. And the Anne in the books does have conflicting feelings about her family. They just don't come across in the film at all because of the choice to make her into this, sarcastic, bitter old hack. I don't see why they couldn't have actually just incorporated these characters more into the film, and they could have done that with just cutting all of those nonsense scenes of Anne telling us about them and actually involving them in scenes together, rather than just having Anne narrate something and then we just get a semi-amusing set piece. Part 4. Make it make sense. Now I want to talk about the problems with the plot. I think the biggest failure of the entire film is that the people who adapted it just have no understanding of what the basic conceits of the plot are, how the logic of the plot works, and it all falls apart because they do not understand this. So one of the big things in the story is, obviously, Anne and Captain Wentworth meet each other again for the first time in years, and it's awkward and weird, and they keep finding themselves moving in the same circles, sometimes by chance, sometimes deliberately, and they find it very difficult to actually speak to each other. At first this makes sense because obviously, he thinks he's been jilted, and she thinks he doesn't love her anymore and must hate her. And she's also, like I said before, quite a shy person to begin with, so it's obvious why they would not really want to engage with each other and resolve their problems. But then, time, associating with someone enough, you have to kind of talk to them a little bit. So they do find themselves getting a little bit closer in the books. But because of the strict rules of society at the time, they find it very difficult to actually be together alone, which they would need to be to actually have the conversation that they need to have in order to realise that they're both still in love with each other and move on. And because they can't actually just get together and talk in a way that's easy, they find they're distracted by other people. So Captain Wentworth has a potential love interest, and also Anne has a potential love interest, and these things distract them. And this all makes sense within the time period, because in the time period, men and women struggled very much to be alone together. There were rules against this sort of thing. So you couldn't just, walk up to someone who you were in love with. You couldn't just, break through the window or break it through the back door and be like, I love you and come back. It's not going to work. You have to leave cards at people's houses. You have to arrange visits. And if you're a woman, you have to have a chaperone all the time. And so it makes sense why they would not be able to just come together and the plot be immediately resolved in the time period. Unfortunately, in the film, they want to have steamy scenes of Anne and Captain Wentworth on the beach together talking, and they have a few scenes like this, and it's like, if they were together in this way and they're looking at each other, and whether they're looking at each other, because obviously it's all, lovesick puppy eyes and all the rest of it, they would just fall in love at that moment in the film. There would be no need for this constant nonsense of will they, won't they, because it doesn't make sense. Because again, they've not recognised that Austen, in her book, is using the time, or the conventions of the time that she's writing in, to make the plot make sense. And part of that is that men and women live these separate lives and are only allowed to come together in very controlled circumstances. If you remove those controlled circumstances, then they would just be able to fix their problem, so you wouldn't have a story. And unfortunately, the filmmakers removed that part of the world because they're together a lot. So this just makes the whole plot not make sense, because the thing that drives it has been taken out, and there's been nothing put in its place. Again, if you want to do a retelling, that's perfectly fine. You just have to find new obstacles to put in the way, and they don't do that in the film. They look like they love each other all the time. They will just get back together. And so this, again, just reiterates that point that I began with, and the main issue that I had with the story. It's not so much that they attempted to do a retelling of it. I think that's fine and can be done fantastically, like in Bridget Jones, but you need to think about what is the main conceit of this plot? What is the driving force of this plot? Why was Anne persuaded against, marrying Captain Wentworth? How could we find a modern analogue to that? Or we just keep it in the past. Either of those things is fine, but you just need to pick one and you just need to do it. You can't sort of do both in this half-assed way and then wonder why, it's crap, which is what it is. So that is my main issue with the story, and I think that is ultimately what is the issue with the characters, and why they don't make sense, and the breaking of the fourth wall. The whole thing, I think, comes down to this. It's just a basic misunderstanding of the text. And like I said at the beginning, it's almost like what they did was they just thought, well, Austen heroine, she will be sassy and fun, and Austen hero will be brooding and, dark and kind of bland, which also isn't really fair to Austen's heroes either. But there we are. That seems to me what the writers did. They read a brief summary on Wikipedia of the plot, assumed those things about what the characters must be like, and just went with it. And this is what we got, and it's just really not very good. However, I will talk about some redeeming qualities, just because, not everything is, 100% terrible. And so I will talk about the one thing that I really enjoyed in this film, and that was Mary, the character of Mary, which is the sister of Anne, who I think was just expertly cast and expertly acted. So Mary was played by an actress called Mia McKenna Bruce, and she just has the perfect face for Mary, because I think she's in her mid-20s, but she has this kind of round face that sort of looks quite childish. Like, she could probably play a teenager and get away with it. She just has that kind of youthful face. But also she clearly is a fully grown woman. And so she sort of looks like she's in this kind of arrested state of development, which I'm sure they also added to in kind of the costuming that they put her in and makeup and things like that. But she just has the perfect look for this character, because the character of Mary is the youngest sibling. She also was the first to marry, which is quite rare in the time period. Usually sisters would get married in order unless, they were incredibly ugly or something. And so she's sort of likes to see herself as much older than she is, but then she's also, like I say, she's basically a baby in a woman's body. She's incredibly immature, she's incredibly narcissistic, and she's incredibly selfish. And she's the only one of these kind of side characters who isn't destroyed by Anne's, sassy, just telling you what she's like in the first 5 minutes. Now, part of that is because you just get a bit more time with Mary on screen, just like you do in the book, as far as I remember anyway. But yeah, I just think that she was really well acted. I loved how they portrayed the character, and I think she was probably the only example of a character where the writers not only understood fully what the character is supposed to do, but they didn't reduce her wholly to nothing in the story. They gave her something to do. She was still very much a part of what was going on. So that would be my one praise of the film, and it was usually the only scenes I think that really made me chuckle a little bit were her scenes. So that was great. I would also say that the acting in general was, of a good standard, as I said earlier. But unfortunately, the characters just weren't very well written. The dialogue was, again, sort of weirdly sometimes modern, but then sometimes kind of stilted in just again, not deciding whether you're modernizing or keeping it to the time period. You need to pick one, and then you need to do it well. And unfortunately, they didn't pick one, and they didn't do it well. And so that's my issue with the film. And so that's everything I want to say about the Netflix adaptation of Persuasion. I don't think I've ever done a video this negative before, but I would like to hear your thoughts on the film adaptation if you've seen it. And also, what do you think more generally about film adaptations? Do you prefer adaptations of books to be more faithful to the text? Or do you like it when they're retellings? Or do you like both? I personally like both. I just think that you have to do them well. And I just don't think that this adaptation did. So there we are. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Otherwise, take care everyone. I'll see you on the next video. Ta-ra!